Welcome to the Numbers Don't Tell Stories show. Each week, we like to give our listeners ideas on how to evaluate numbers through story. Our desire is to entertain you and provide you with useful insight. All right, welcome back, everybody. Here we are again for another episode of Numbers Don't Tell Stories. I'm Tom Etchison. He's Matthew Dix. We're your co-hosts for this process, this podcast. And today we're going to be taking on a tweet that came out here in January, and so I'm going to throw this up on the screen here, Matthew, and share this with our listeners and our viewers. Try and describe this. So here's the tweet for this, and you can tell here what's happened is an approximately 1,100 pound, 8-foot in diameter piece of a rocket launch vehicle, or purportedly has landed somewhere in Kenya, and so obviously we've got a report of this, and this is landing in the middle of Kenya, and it's very, very interesting from the standpoint of it's not something you see every day. And so the fact that yeah, exactly, well, maybe that'll become more of a thing, but it's like, so now all of a sudden you've got this piece of debris that no one can really identify, and eventually it gets identified, and it's being tweeted, and you realize there's really no context for this, right? So as you see this tweet, you think to yourself, and your reaction was, well, it's not happening every day. Well, for all we know, maybe it is, and we just don't know, and nobody identifies the objects, or it's falling in places where nobody sees it, or whatever. And it got me to thinking about, well, okay, well, there it is. I would just gloss over this, and I don't know. I wouldn't know what to make of this, other than I got really curious about this. And so I went out there and started doing some research, and it's amazing. There are literally tens of thousands of space debris out there coming off of rockets, things that are re-entering that Earth's atmosphere. They get blown apart, for whatever reason. Things are hitting other satellites, space vehicles. And you start to think about it, and I started to think about it from a data perspective, because you really can't see data or numbers. Yet when a very small piece of space debris hits a one of our space vehicles or whatever, when those vehicles come back, they measure the diameter of those things. They look at it in great detail, trying to understand what hit the vehicle. And it's incredibly interesting that we track all of this stuff. All of this space debris is tracked in a database, and they track small, medium, and large pieces of space debris out there. And I thought it was incredibly interesting to put this out here, when really, for the most part, we have no context
right
about space debris.
Yeah, or even this object itself. I always think the idea that 1,100 pounds is a number that doesn't really make any sense to most people. So what you have to do is essentially apply context to it. And I happen to know 1,100 pounds is about the weight of a very small car, or about the weight of actually a very large horse. I grew up on a horse farm, so I know that those Clydesdales can weigh up to 1,000 pounds. So this is essentially a Volkswagen or a Clydesdale falling out of the sky and landing on you. And I think that context is important, because whether you thought 1,100 pounds was an enormous number or a not so big number, When it's a Volkswagen, it's pretty clear what it's going to be if it hits you, right? There's no question as to what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So just throwing a weight out like that, I always think is silly, especially when it's a number as large as that, unless we provide some context to it.
Well, and the thought of something that is 8 feet in diameter, you're talking about something that's well in excess the size of, like, a Shaquille O'Neal or somebody like that, the largest basketball player. And that thing is hurling through, space and our atmosphere and the sky. If it hits a plane, that's a real problem, those sorts of things. And so you're right, we just don't have any context. And so where, like, if you could have, having these two individuals looking at the piece of space debris kind of helps put the diameter in some context. But you're right, being able to try to figure out, okay, well, here's what this thing weighs in comparison to something else that we can, understand, a Volkswagen Bug or something like that.
Yeah, I like as a storyteller to fuse ideas together. So like in a case of this, it's 8 feet in diameter and 1,100 pounds. So, in an attempt possibly to be amusing too, because humor always lands and is sticky as well, I might say it's essentially a dining room table that weighs as much as a Volkswagen landing in your kitchen, so that really creates a visual image. And the idea of fusing the two things together. So I don't need to find something that weighs 1,100 pounds and happens to also be 8 feet in diameter. I like the idea of taking two things, pushing them together. And I think the best way to make a story sticky is to push two things together that don't normally get pushed together. So dining room
Right.
tables and Volkswagens work really well, whereas I would not push a Volkswagen and some other automotive part of of appropriate size together because it just doesn't create the memory. We remember things that are unique, odd, unusual, and amusing. So really heavy dining room tables, and then actually saying crashing through your kitchen ceiling actually adds an additional visual to it that I think actually makes it even more sticky. So that's what I tend to do in storytelling when I'm trying to bring context to numbers like this.
Well, and I think that brings it home for people, like, if you're thinking about this in a business context and you're trying to describe, either some manufacturing process or, a CNC machine that's germane to your process, that's got something. It's good to put that in context because not everybody's going to understand those sorts of dimensions and so on. And so being able to drive those things home for people, so like the next time they see their kitchen table, they're thinking, oh yeah, that's the size of this thing that we were talking about at work. And now it comes into context, right? And it weighs as much as my daughter's Volkswagen Beetle outside in the driveway. And
Right.
you try to imagine, okay, well, what would I do to lift that or to move that, or what happens if it does come crashing down? Those are these things that you have to better understand. And so again, you put together a tweet, and you put something out there just like you might put together a graph or a report at work. You have to give people some of those things in order to better see and facilitate and understand them walking away with something that's going to stick.
Yeah. You can also adjust, we'll say manipulate motivation and emotion simply by changing that story as well. So when I have it crashing through your kitchen ceiling, I have a goal in mind, which is to promote fear in you because I put it through your kitchen ceiling, right? But I could have just as easily said it's like a dining room table that weighs as much as a Volkswagen crashing into the ocean or some desert or some forest across the world. And now I've sort of eliminated fear to a certain degree, right? So simply by deciding where I want this thing landing in my context, I can either make this something that you're worried about and maybe calling your congressperson about to say what's going on, or I can just let it land in the ocean in my story. And honestly, I think you might be okay with it at that point. You might walk away from the story not even thinking that it might land on your own head someday. So just by altering the context of something a little bit, we can manipulate emotions and motivations and even sometimes the actions of the people who are hearing our story.
Right. Well, and I think it's also important in that same vein, and it may not be about creating fear, but also creating scale and scope of the problem, right? So if I were to say, okay, well, Russia, the US, and China all have in excess of 4,000 pieces of space junk that are associated with those countries sitting out there swirling around, and that's being added to all the time. Now you understand that there's a much broader context here, and over the size of the earth and various other things, it may not be frequent, but this is something that is going to be a very real problem. And it's something that you even might describe that, hey, satellites have to be programmed to avoid and detect space junk and move around it as they, we all have this vision of a satellite just orbiting the earth and moving in its own trajectory, yet those things are making evasive maneuvers to get around space junk all the time. And that's a great visual for people. So many people use Starlink and things like that. Hey, I'm getting my internet from outer space. Well, those satellites are evading this very same space junk in their process. So, that also helps bring this, much more, make it much more tangible for people.
Yeah. There's a report out that there's an asteroid that has a 1 in 77 chance of striking the Earth in 2032 that just came out recently.
Right.
And one of my students read it and they said, well, thank goodness it's 1 in 77. And, because I wanted to like make them understand how that's not entirely improbable, I pointed out to them, I said, well, we've been in school for 82 days. How many snow days have we had so far? And they said, one. And I said, so you can say that we have a 1 in 82 chance of having a snow day so far this year, right? Did you expect to have a snow day this year? And the kid said, yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, well, if you expected to end up with a snow day this year, isn't it at least slightly probable that we can expect this asteroid to hit the Earth? And then another kid, of course, said, well, it looks like it's only like 100 yards across, right? Which is another one of those numbers that you think, well, what does that really mean? And when another student looked it up, it meant that it would not wipe out the Earth, but would absolutely wipe out an entire city, right? So suddenly numbers in my classroom had terrifying consequences simply
Yeah.
by taking what were just, digits in the minds of my students and applying them to things that fall from the sky like this piece of a rocket ship.
Well, and that's what's so important about noticing a number and then doing something with it versus just skipping over it, which most of us would skip over 1 in 77 because you never think about it in terms of, something like that's tangible with your kids in a snow day or some other event. And it's not like it's winning the lottery, which is 1 in X billion chance. This is a very real possibility. And then when you say, okay, well, then the possibility is destroying a city, then it becomes even more real. And I think that's what we're talking about here, and that's why we bring these things out of the news and out of the social media world, is because we all of a sudden now realize, okay, well, these things we're skipping over that we're just scrolling through, like, hey, there's some powerful meaning there.
Right. I've never bought a lottery ticket in my entire life, but I can tell you if my chances of winning were 1 in 77, I would be
You'd be
buying
doing
lottery tickets all day long. Yeah.
well, but that's the perfect example of people ignoring numbers, right? People buy lottery tickets all the time knowing that their odds are ridiculously low of winning, and yet they do it anyway because we don't understand those numbers. Just
Right.
like we can't understand 1 in 77.
Right. I learned this week, Tom, speaking of another number, we spend more money, Americans, on scratch tickets than we spend on concert tickets and sports tickets combined. Believe that staggering number. Perhaps because I've never bought a scratch ticket in my life, but that means we're spending more money like in the gas station buying tickets that often amount to nothing instead of going to see athletes and musicians and Broadway performers. All of those are being left behind in favor of scratching a ticket that takes about 4 seconds to scratch. It's unbelievable.
Well, and there's further story there around the consistency with which people do it, right? That's where the numbers are staggering because they're doing it day in, day out, week in, week out, those sorts of things. It's an incredibly consistent habit for some people.
Right.
And so that's why versus the concerts come around every few months or whatever it is, and you don't tend to think about that in the same sort of consistent expenditure. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's
Look how much fun
fascinating.
we had with numbers. We started with a piece of space junk, and eventually we got to scratch tickets, and all just by bringing context to numbers.
Right. And talking about the chances, the odds, which was missing from all of this, right? So what were the odds of this hitting Kenya? That would have been really interesting to, see this and to, think about it from that perspective. But anyway, great episode today. Thanks for playing along, Matthew. Look forward to the next one.
Yeah, same here. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, all
That was
those
really
numbers suddenly
good.
came into my head. I was like, oh, right, the 1 in 77 and
Yeah, I saw that asteroid. I missed bringing that up. So the next one is that, and I don't know if we want to mess with another one tonight or if you want to
I can
wait.
roll out one more if you want. I'm sitting
Okay.
here and I told my wife 8:15, so I
Okay.
said I think we'll probably wrap around 8:15 and we can.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
she
we
doesn't
can
care
get them.
actually. For the record, she actually doesn't care. She just was wondering.
No, so the next one is all of those diseases or disorders and
Oh
the
yeah,
percentage change and so on. And so I was going to talk about that from the shock value perspective versus you know are we supposed to draw something politically from it or whatever,
right.
it's like
Yeah, yeah,
that's not the point. So
yep, yeah.
okay,
That those
so
numbers are astounding. But
yeah,
also, like, I don't know. If you put some thought into it, they just start to make a lot more sense and they're less astounding.
well, but that's going to
Right.
be a great discussion
Yes.
point. So
Right. Hmm.
all right. Welcome back to Numbers Don't Tell Stories. Great to have you back listening to our podcast. I'm Tom Etchison. That's Matthew Dix. We're your co-hosts for this adventure. And tonight we're going to look at something for this episode is kind of interesting from a numbers perspective. I'm gonna share a a a thing that we brought in from social media, a news story that we brought in from social media here. And this is something that we find in business a lot. We find in news, social media. People use numbers for shock value. And so you might be able to look at these numbers around diseases or disorders and think about them. This is showing the percentage increase, and this is floating around the vast interwebs, and so you can find this and look at it. And what's interesting in a business context, somebody might throw up a number around revenue. And the real story is, and I can remember doing this. I was working for a publicly traded company back a long time ago, and we would have to go, and I was part of a support team to the sales, a technical set of people that would go with the sales team to try to close deals with big companies. And I remember the salesperson that I went along with, I went and I visited him at his office in Silicon Valley. And I remember there was a guy who was walking, it was near the end of the quarter, and there was a guy walking up and down the hallway, carrying a baseball bat. And it was an imagery around like, hey, we got to make this quarter. And so you make the quarter, somebody puts up a revenue number, but nobody actually knows the story behind it. So there's this shock value, and there can be great benefit in seeing these huge numbers, and people don't really understand the things that go into making up those numbers. And so I think we use numbers for shock. And so you could look at these numbers and look at something like chronic fatigue syndrome up 11,000%. Well, in 1990, was that something anybody would admit to? Versus now, everybody thinks they're tired because we talk about it all the time.
Right.
And so there are things like that. So I, I see this, I see the reason why they put it up there, but I think most people look at that and they can't make sense of what an 11,000% increase. They can think about, oh, hey, eggs are 100% more than they were last year, right? That's a double in the price, but they can't make sense of 11,000.
No, and I would say that the first thing I notice on this set of numbers, this data set, is the heading, which I always pay attention to. So it says increase since 1990. What it really should say is increased diagnosis since 1990, because it's ridiculous to think that we are actually measuring rates of actual disease versus how much of this disease is being diagnosed. I think about autism, for example. My daughter happens to have autism, so I'm familiar with it.
Mhm.
That rate of increase, 2000%. If I think back to my childhood, I can think of the kids in my class who clearly had autism who did not get labeled as autistic because labeling at that time, or there was no identification and there wasn't a great awareness of it. So is autism up 2000%, or were those kids just sort of the awkward, lonely, socially, distant kids of my youth? Probably. So I think a lot of this uh, has to do more with our willingness to diagnose things, our willingness to admit to things, our attempt to get help for things. So, like, for example, if your grandmother had Alzheimer's in 1990, there may have not been the social supports available to take care of that grandmother or to give you what
Right.
you needed, whereas nowadays maybe those social supports exist, so you're more likely to get your grandmother diagnosed so you can get some of the services that are available. So I always look at the heading first and say, how are they framing this argument? Because oftentimes it's being framed in the way the person who is presenting the data set wants it to be framed.
Right, and usually they're trying to use that shock to prove one point or another, whether it's political or whatever, and that's just the point associated with numbers is when you start recognizing, when you start slowing down, which is part of what we're trying to get people to do, is like, hey, you're seeing this now. I slow down and I start to think about this. Now there's more than just a passing, oh, well, this is just, somebody playing politics or somebody trying to shock me into doing something or whatever, manipulate me. I now start to ask questions around like, well, what does it mean to have an 11,000? Like, how could you even possibly get there, right?
Right.
And you start to question all of these things that you would have otherwise just bypassed previously. And I think that's so important here as you start to notice data and you start to say, okay, well, what could be the useful information that would help me consume this? Like your story around autism, like you now have a way of being able to go back in your memory banks and realize, oh, hey, this is something that was clearly present but wasn't necessarily diagnosed. It's always been there probably, but it's now, there may be an increase or various other things associated with it, along with, something like chronic fatigue or whatever. It's just a way of getting yourself comfortable with what questions could I ask? How could I find this? How could I get better educated around what does this mean?
Right. I think what I would advise to listeners is sort of the more shocking the number, the more distrust you should have around the number. It doesn't mean the number is not going to ultimately prove true and have value, but in my experience, just the more I am stunned by a number, the more I have to dig to make sure that I'm not purposely being stunned by that number in an attempt to, you know, manipulate me, mitigate my feelings, convince me to think one way or another. The thing I always remind myself of when I'm looking at numbers like this, these stunning numbers, there's a gas station in my town. You have to drive to get to it, but it's always about 20 cents less than any other of the gas stations in town. And it's like the lowest gas you can kind of get in Connecticut. And so the lines are always endlessly long at this gas station. And my next door neighbor, I saw him leaving one day, and I said, "Hey, where are you going, Andrew?" And he said, "I'm going to go get gas on the Berlin Turnpike because it's the cheapest you can get." And I said, "Well, it's going to be like a 10-minute drive to get there, and you're probably going to have to wait." And he goes, "I know, but it's the cheapest." And I said, "Well, how big is your gas tank?" And he said, it's 12 gallons. And I said, "All right, so you're going to save 20 cents on 12 gallons of gas. How much money are you saving during your 20-minute drive and 10-minute wait to get the gas? Like you're making $2.40 for
Right.
30 minutes of effort, And he paused for a minute and then he said, "Yeah, I'm going to do it anyway." Um, but like that's the idea that like we look at a number and we go, "Wow, 20 cents less than anywhere else. Why would I not go and get gas there?" And maybe you should. Maybe if you are
Right.
pinching pennies, that's maybe something you should do. But again, a shocking number like that, you take a step back and you ask what it really means, and pretty soon you realize you're not making a lot of money through all that effort.
Right. And you most people, never do the math, right? So like if you're presenting, that there's some massive increase in your, your financial results or something like that, immediately somebody's going to question that. Like, you're immediately going to have to review that number and make sure, okay, well, what's behind that, if you have some astounding result, and there is there's this, I think, reluctance in a lot of cases to actually do the math and make sense of what does this mean in service of your gas example. Like there's no way for most people that that's going to make any sense unless you're buying hundreds of gallons.
Right.
And that's what's so interesting, that we think we're saving money, but people don't know how to value their time. They don't know how to put a value to a variety of things, and so it's just better to ignore it, which again gets you back to these things. Like, now you're going to recognize, hopefully, after hearing that story about the gas or hearing about these crazy shocking numbers associated with diagnoses, that you're now all of a sudden thinking to yourself, oh, what is the math behind that?
Right. Yeah.
Should I
My
care about that?
my son once, looking at that famous gas station on the Berlin Turnpike in Connecticut, we drove by it once, and my son said, "How come there's always landscaper trucks at that gas station?" Which is exactly what you just said, right? So I told my son, people line up at that gas station because it's the cheapest gas. It doesn't make sense unless we happen to be driving by it to get gas there. But for landscapers who are filling trucks and lawnmowers and leaf blowers, like they are literally buying hundreds of gallons of gas per week,
Right.
probably to do their work. So for them, it makes sense. So it's so interesting how that number tells a story in both ways. Like if my son understands the meaning behind the number, he can answer the question himself, why are the landscaping trucks always at that gas station? So just doing that math will sort of just make the world seem a little more sensible to you, and you won't drive by something just wondering why it is the way it is.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that he recognized that, because number one, it's a pattern, and number two, that pattern provides the answer,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where the the benefit is. That's where the value is. And so I think what we were trying to talk about and talk through is this notion of shock, and do you pay attention to it? Do you pay? Do you take the time to do the math? Do you take the time to go and dig into it, or do you take action just based on being shocked?
Right. Yeah.
And I think what we're trying to counsel is that in most cases, that shock is probably not worth this, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And so you have to dig, and you have to do a little bit of work, and you have to think it through. And I think that's kind of the point of this episode, and the stories behind that. That was, it's really informative, and you have to start thinking, in your own life, what are your gas station moments? What are your sales moments? A lot of people can identify with end of quarter type stuff, like, hey, we beat our estimates, but what did we have to give up to get there?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and numbers like this just tell you, once you sort of put some thought into them, they also just tell you, if you can figure out who put these numbers out, what they're aiming at, what their angle is, right? You can really sort of drill down into someone's motivation without ever speaking to them, just by understanding how they choose to frame data in a way that tries to get you to think something. You can pretty quickly determine the kind of thought process that goes into something like this and what they're hoping to get from it. So not only can you make sense of the data, but you can start to understand the person who's presenting the data. And I think that's also very useful.
Well, and to that point, like, just to kind of wrap this up with that gas station example, there may be a reason why that gas station is trying to attract the landscaper trucks, right? Because they're going in and getting the monster drinks and various other things, and at various points during their day. And maybe that's a much higher margin for them in some ways, and they're bringing in that recurring revenue by attracting those folks back through their doors. And
Yeah, I
so
had a I talked to my son what a loss leader was, and I said,
right.
basically, the price of gas is almost insignificant to a gas station. It's all the other things that you're going inside and purchasing where they're making most of their profits. So yeah, that gas station might actually be losing money on their gas, but making a windfall on everything else that's being purchased.
Right. Great episode. Thanks, Matthew, for playing along, and we'll can't wait to do the next one.
Yeah, can't wait.
Thanks. You've reached the end of the show. We ask that if you found this useful, that you please tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you're watching us via YouTube, please like and subscribe.